got to go down to London to give a keynote to the team. The team, of course, being the Spitfire Audio family. Something I'm very proud to be a part of. And with just a couple of hours to go, I still have to actually write the thing. Now, it's not just because I'm an arch procrastinator, it's also because there's a difficult dynamic with the team. You see, the problem is, as the team gets bigger, Paul and I's roles have kind of reduced to that of telling the kind of the founder's story. And for some people in the team, there's about 50 of us now, it's just an absolute nightmare because they've heard it so many times. So I have to try and kind of spice things up with different stories. So today, I'm going down to London to talk to these guys about porn! Yes, I just encouraged the Spitfire team to say the word porn, and I'll be buying them all a pint later. Not only that, I got them to say the word porn very loudly in none other than the Imperial War Museum. So, what's all this porn business about? Well, it's not that we're changing direction at Spitfire with our business plan. It's a story I told to the team. I'd love to tell you too, but I'm knackered, so I'm going to get back to Edinburgh and pick this up tomorrow. Okay. Recuperated. The story is my life in samplers and how they assisted in my career as a porn music composer.
3 things you possibly didn't know about porn.
Number 1.
How to keep the actors razzling all day.
If you've ever watched Boogie Nights, there's an assertion that video changed the porn industry forever. But I would say the greatest impact on the porn industry is not video, it's not the internet, it's the combination of Viagra and cocaine. This enabled porn producers to film an entire feature-length porn film in a single day, and made for some really extraordinary outtakes. I remember seeing one once where it was clearly a break. Someone was sitting having a fag, someone was reading the kind of Morning Sun, and there was a guy kind of changing one of the lamps, and someone had the foresight to switch the camera on, because in the foreground there was this kind of blurry image kind of bouncing up and down. And as the cameraman pulled the kind of zoom back, you could see that there were 2 actors just razzling the bejesus out of each other, so coked up, so Viagra'd up, they just couldn't stop having sex. A lot of people think it's apocryphal that I used to write music for porn films, but for 2 or 3 years I became somewhat a kind of elder statesman of porn music. But we have to rewind a little bit further to get a bit of context. So my first paid job was actually as a child actor back in 1978 in a film called Never Neverland. I played Petula Clark's son. In fact, my first line in the film was, "You're sleeping with me," which was somewhat ominous, seeing as I was playing a 6-year-old and I was addressing my cousin. For that 8-week shoot, I was paid the princely sum of £2,000, roughly $3,000, which in today's money, so that was 1978, in today's money that would be just shy of $12,000. My parents made a deal with me and I wasn't allowed to spend that money until my 16th birthday. They also said I was never allowed to do a child acting job again, which I will thank them for eternally. And so what did I do nearly a decade later? I did what any self-respecting 16-year-old would do and bought a sampler. No, that's actually not true, because that would have been 1988 and no one was buying samplers except for Ferris Bueller's parents, and he didn't even like his or use it properly, and he was also a totally fictitious character. So with hindsight, I think I was one of very few 16-year-olds on the planet in 1988 with a sampler, and the sampler I picked was a second-hand one of these, a Kurzweil 250. I actually bought the XP version, which basically meant it didn't have that keyboard. I bought it for 2,000 quid, which in 1988 pounds is roughly kind of $8,000 US today. So if you imagine a second-hand sampler for $8,000, absolutely bonkers. But them's were the days. Now the thing that Kurzweil really trumpeted about the K250, which is quite curious in hindsight, is that all of the samples were burnt into ROM chips. So there was no RAM, or very little, about 8 seconds sampling time, 10-bit mono. And when you did sample something, there was no means of storing these samples. So every time I kind of sample my little Fender Rhodes, I'd switch it off at night and have to resample it the next day to continue working on my track. So didn't go to college, I became a baker instead, left home when I was 18 and scrabbled together from my meagre earnings as a baker money to create or slowly build up my home studio, which was an Atari 1040 ST running Qbeat and a D5, Roland D5 keyboard as my master controller, connected to my pride and joy, my K250 XP, which ran into a Tascam Portal 1. Roll forward a decade, I'd given up my job as a baker, become a full-time musician, and through my spurious show business contacts, started working on porn films. Now you have to remember, this would have been 1995, 1996. In this day, and it doesn't seem that long ago, Britain was an incredibly kind of uptight nation. Hardcore pornography was totally illegal, but someone found a loophole, which was if you had a doctor speak at the beginning of a film for 2 minutes and you only had married couples doing their hardcore porn, you could dress it up as an educational video. So suddenly these swamped the marketplace, like W.H. Smith's, there was an outcry that they were stocking them. These kind of guide to sex, guide to loving, all of these things became huge news. And because basically a British person had never seen an erect penis go into a vagina in the history of Britain, they were just didn't notice that my Kurzweil was unable to provide me with round robins and dynamic layers. Didn't seem to bother anyone. So I kind of moved on and got loads of jobs writing these edutainment videos, if you will.
3 things you possibly didn't know about porn.
Number 2.
No rhythm, please. We're British.
Now, with American porn, and particularly the porn in the 1970s, it was quite rhythmic, kind of wah-wah guitars, rim-shot drum kits, funky congas, that kind of stuff. In Britain, when we created our hardcore, the rule was no rhythm. There'd always be a tambourine or a rim shot that was in time with a part of the body that was moving on screen, and this was considered to be in terribly poor taste, which is why British hardcore always had a soft, ambient tone to it. So, mid-20s, writing music to picture and being paid to watch porn continuously must have been a dream job. It kind of was at first, but it soon became very similar to baking. And what I mean by that is, if I spent an entire day baking pastries, the last thing I wanted when I got home was a donut. So it was terrible for my sex life. So by 1996, I'd done quite a lot of these films, and I think I'd bought an Ensoniq SQR Plus as an additional kind of sound module. The K250 XP started holding me back because I just couldn't store any of my favourite sounds that I'd been making. So I plumped for an EMU ESI 32, which, if I could recall correctly, was about 1,600 quid, about $2,000 back in 1996. Now, in those days, there was real tribalism regarding samplers. You were either in the Akai camp or the EMU camp. It was almost like kind of Rangers versus Celtic. And in fact, when I meet people who made music in that era, the first question that is usually exchanged is, were you an Akai or an EMU boy? So the reason it cost me so much money is I had it fully loaded, 32 megabytes of RAM, it was 32 voices, but the most important thing was storage. Little 1.44 megabyte floppy disks. So if you used the whole RAM, you'd maybe have to save it down to 12 floppies, which is why studios back in that day were just these piles of floppy disks everywhere until these things came along. Oh, the joys of SCSI and iOmega zip drive system, 100 megabytes of storage. It was revolutionary. So backing up just one more step, I went to a school in West London called Holland Park Comprehensive, a veritable borstal of a school, and the factory on the hill for the slightly more kind of arty students was the BBC. So when all of my friends came back from studying science of the seas and kind of African studies, whatever, they all ended up working for the BBC. And because they heard I was writing to picture, they would give me a little bit of fat off the bone, if you know what I mean. There'd be an occasional spot on a travel programme, etc., etc. So I started building up a bit of a factual entertainment career and eventually got to do the Top Gear theme, which made my guitarist, that basically would usually come in like every other week to do a session with me, he was very happy by this because, you know, the Top Gear theme by the Allman Brothers was a kind of guitarist's favourite. I was also still working on porn. I'll never forget bringing him in. He was like, what are we working on today? And I said, well, this is a porn film that is kind of regarding two women who really, really like each other. And I want you to do some kind of Joe Satriani in the background whilst these two ladies really, really like each other. And he said to me, so you're telling me there's going to be a film that I can get that has two women really liking each other with me playing guitar in the background? Now, for any of you who know guitarists...
3 things you possibly didn't know about porn.
Number 3, and this is the hard and fast rule of Porn Club, never score the money shot.
Male porn stars were only paid if they achieved climax. It defines hardcore as it is a demonstration that the sex act was for real.
It's kind of like stepping on a gag in a comedy. You just never went anywhere near the money shot. Obviously, after the money shot was complete, you'd have this wonderful sense of relief that you could put into the music, even celebration. But always, when the money shot was concerned, keep it clear, tacit. And it was around this time that this little thing called the internet came on the scene. Now, whilst this has all had a very profound effect on our lives over the last couple of decades, its immediate effect on the porn industry was catastrophic. So this area of my life just dried up. So I used my emerging talents as a factual entertainment composer to diverge with my porn past to work on a series of porn documentaries. The one that really sticks in my mind was that of Shishi LaRue, who used to do movies starring guys who really liked each other. And it was amazing to watch his directorial technique. He'd basically be in one room, shouting down the corridor into the room where all the action was happening, this kind of shorthands of things he wanted to do. He's like a master puppeteer, but with sex and bits. And the only thing I can say it reminded me of is that children's toy, Bop It. It was like, stuck it, flick it, pick it. So as the factual entertainment stuff picked up, so did my profile, and I, with my business partner at the time, was asked to do this, a couple of remixes from the original Grease soundtrack, and the ESI 32 simply wasn't up to the task. So we bought one of these, an E4 XT Ultra, which I think back in the day originally was about £9,000. We paid about £3,000. So in today's money, you're looking at least like $6,000, $7,000. Absolutely nuts. But it had crazy spec, 250 megabytes of RAM, 128 voices, I believe, and an internal hard drive of 500 megabytes. And you could also use these short-lived jazz drives, which I think actually made iMega go bust. So when we talk about this period from the early 80s to the late 90s, when we were all using hardware, was how you were not just employed as a musician, but as an operator of this hardware, because it was very complicated and unintuitive to use. So if you invested in stuff like a PPG Wave, you could get sessions not only as a performer, but as an operator of that piece of kit. And so it came to pass that because I owned an E4 XT, I got a gig as MD for this dude. And what the E4s did, racks of them, was enable you to go on the road with backing tracks, with backing vocals, but also occasionally if they were really difficult dance routines, you'd be able to plug in little vocal bits. If it was too difficult for him to do a move, he'd just mime that particular bit. And so that's something that I did with the E4 XT for a couple of years. I also, at that point, did a documentary about, it's a tragic story about this woman called Lolo Ferrari, who unfortunately she died whilst we were making the documentary. So it was my first foray into something that was kind of seriously emotional. And this was the point at which I started looking into orchestral samples and of course the eponymous Gigastudio. Now the thing about Gigastudios is they didn't run on Macs, so you had them kind of running as slave PCs. I had about 6 of them. You needed loads to be able to, run a proper orchestral template. So I would run those as slaves, and internally, this is when my love affair with the EXS24 started. I was, however, late to the game with Gigastudio, and very soon after I invested in all of these PCs, they promptly went bust, courtesy of Tascam, which meant our world switched to Kontakt, and my first film using Kontakt as the main platform was a Mandy Moore film called Chasing Liberty, by which point I was firmly out of the porn camp. So I guess in the 10 years since switching to Kontakt, we've kind of come full circle. So instead of using a sampler that costs $6,000–7,000, I'm actually not using a sampler at all. I'm using a plugin that's free. And it's really exciting to be a part of that storyline. I guess another little thing that's nice about the reason we had our chat at Imperial War Museum yesterday is when we set up Spitfire, it was just something that was on the shelf, a company that I had dormant. And I said to Paul, well, seeing as around the corner there's a place that has a Spitfire hanging from the ceiling, I may go there for inspiration for how the whole aesthetic of Spitfire. And that's where it was born, hence the poignancy of yesterday's summit there. Thanks always for watching. If you're new to the channel, hit subscribe. If you like what I do, hit like. And if you want to be notified, hit that bell.